I once got admitted to this old-looking hospital. It had a vibe, like the kind of place that had seen way too much over the years. It was near Queenstown, which itself looked kinda old, so maybe that explained it. My whole family always went there whenever they needed medical care, so it had basically become our family hospital. I was there to get a growth removed from my face. Nothing major, but then it got infected. And just like that, I was stuck in a hospital bed for almost a week. The first 2 nights were totally fine, boring even. But on the 3rd night, things got weird. There was this old lady in the bed next to mine. When I first got admitted, her family mentioned that she had dementia, so she was always mumbling things that didn't make much sense. Sometimes it was actually kinda entertaining. She kept calling me by her daughter's name. Let's just call her daughter Rose, to keep things simple. But then, on the 3rd night, she said something that gave me the worst kind of chills. Out of nowhere, she looked straight at me and went, "Rose, tell that lady to stop staring at me. I'm scared." She was pointing at the bed across from her. Problem was, the bed was empty. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe she was just confused. But she started shrieking, getting more and more frantic. I hit the call button and a nurse came in, pulled the curtains around the empty bed, and just like that, the old lady calmed down. I thought that was the end of it, but the next night it got worse. This time she wasn't pointing at the empty bed. She was pointing at the chair. The chair right next to me. I ignored her again, but man, I could feel it. That heavy, cold feeling in the air. The kind that makes your skin crawl for no reason. By the 5th day, the old lady got discharged and I was left alone in the ward. Well, alone except for the nurses. I thought, great, finally some peace and quiet. But I was wrong. That night, I was just lying there, minding my business, when I noticed something moving outside the window. Just a slow, swaying motion back and forth. I turned my head and saw this white cloth caught on the tree outside. No hair, no face, just a cloth moving like it had a mind of its own. It didn't feel right. I kept watching it for a few seconds, just trying to convince myself it was just some random cloth stuck on a branch. But then, it lifted. Not like the wind caught it. No, it straight up floated up into the air. I flipped over, facing the other side, pretending like I didn't just see what I saw. I told myself to sleep, but in the middle of the night, I woke up. I was facing the window, and that white cloth, it was dangling outside, not caught in the tree anymore, but hanging right outside my window from the top of the building. I tried to turn, tried to look away, but my body wouldn't move. It was like something was holding me down. My only option was to shut my eyes tight and start praying. I don't even remember when I fell asleep, but I must have at some point, because when I woke up, the sun was rising, and that thing was gone. That same day, more people were admitted to the ward, and I swear, I never felt more relieved to have company. Looking back, as terrifying as the whole thing was, part of me kinda wished the old lady was still there. At least she saw whatever was happening too. But it didn't stop there. On my 6th night, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. The kind that were just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough to make you second-guess yourself. I thought it was a nurse, doing rounds. But then the sound stopped, right outside my room. The door didn't open. No one came in, just silence. And then, the curtain around my bed moved. Not a lot, just a small shift, like someone had brushed against it. I felt my breath hitch in my throat. I was wide awake now, staring at the ceiling, trying not to move. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was going to burst. Then, something pressed against the mattress near my feet. Like weight. Like someone had just sat down on the edge of my bed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The pressure stayed there for what felt like forever. And then, just as suddenly as it came, it lifted. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe my mind was messing with me after everything that had happened. But then I noticed something. The chair next to my bed, the one the old lady had pointed at, wasn't facing the same way anymore. It had been moved, turned slightly towards my bed, as if someone had been sitting there. Watching? That was my last night in the hospital. The doctors discharged me the next afternoon and I didn't argue. I practically ran out of that place. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what was in that hospital with me. But I do know one thing. Whatever it was real. And it was watching. My wife works at a hospital that specializes in traumatic injuries, long-term care, and end-of-life care. It's not just a place for the elderly. There are young patients too. Some were in motorcycle accidents. Others were victims of gunshot wounds. It's the kind of place where people either recover slowly, get transferred to intensive care, or unfortunately, pass away. The other night, we watched a ghost movie, and later, she recommended it to a coworker. That led to a conversation about her job, and I asked her how it felt working in a place where people regularly die. She's been there for years, and in that time, hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people have passed away. Not because it's a bad place, but because it's the last stop for many patients. She doesn't work directly with patients. She's in administration, handling paperwork, and coordinating with families and caregivers. She rarely goes into patient rooms, except when she needs a signature or has to deliver documents. But for a short time when she first started, she had to work night shifts to cover for another manager. That was brief, but she said if she ever had to work nights again, she'd find another job. The hospital at night is completely different. Most of the administrative offices are empty, and only the medical staff is around. They turn off most of the lights near her office because those departments only operate during the day: billing, admissions, records. So at night, her office was in the middle of this dark, empty space. She would keep herself busy, always playing music or a podcast in the background. But what really unsettled her was having to leave her office to go to the restroom or grab a snack. That meant walking through what she called a dead office space. Sometimes, while she was working, she'd hear moaning. At first, she assumed it was a patient wandering the halls. It happens. A patient, even one who seems too weak, will sometimes suddenly get up and walk around, almost zombie-like. The first time she heard it, she thought someone had gotten out of bed and called the nurses' station to report it. They checked every room and found that all patients were accounted for. That gave her chills. Another thing that freaked her out was the pattern of deaths. She noticed, and the nurses did too, that deaths always seemed to come in threes. One person would pass, then another, and then another, almost like a chain reaction. It happened too many times for it to be just a coincidence. And then there were the cats. The hospital has a small garden where stray cats tend to hang out. Patients, staff, and visitors sometimes feed them, but there's something strange about them. Whenever someone dies, more cats appear. It's not just one or two. She's seen a whole group of them suddenly show up, just sitting there watching. One of the creepiest things that happened to her was when she had to get some paperwork signed by a family member. The relative agreed to meet her in the patient's room, an elderly woman who was unresponsive, basically in a coma. My wife got there first, sat in the chair next to the bed, and started reviewing the paperwork. Then, out of nowhere, the woman started speaking in a different language, just murmuring, but continuously. My wife thought nothing of it at first, assuming the woman was speaking her native language. When the family member arrived, my wife casually asked what language the grandmother spoke. The relative looked confused and said, "Just English." She didn't know what to make of it. The woman had clearly been speaking something else. And then there was COVID. That was the hardest time for everyone at the hospital. They lost so many patients, not necessarily due to the virus itself, but because when family visits were banned, many patients just seemed to give up. My wife said it was heartbreaking. She came home crying almost every day, emotionally drained from seeing so many people slowly fade away without their loved ones by their side. Some of the nurses believe the hospital is haunted. Too many weird things happen, and not just at night. Doors that open on their own, lights flickering in rooms that are supposed to be empty, call buttons going off when there's no one there. One of her coworkers swears she saw a shadow move across the hallway on a floor that had no patients at the time. There's one hallway in particular that people avoid. It's an older section of the hospital, not used much anymore. Staff members have reported seeing someone standing at the end of the corridor, just standing there. But when they look away for a second and glance back, gone. Security cameras have picked up strange distortions in that area, but never anything clear. My wife tries not to think about these things too much. She doesn't like talking about them, because the more you acknowledge something, the more it seems to make itself known. But she won't deny it. There's something off about that hospital at night, and she's just glad she doesn't have to be there alone anymore. I'm a nurse in a palliative care unit in an old hospital, and over the years, I've seen some things I can't explain. When you work in a place where people pass away regularly, you either get used to it or you start noticing the strange things lurking in the background. Our unit has 9 rooms spread along a long hallway. At the entrance, there's an elevator, a cleaning supply room on one side, and the nurse's station on the other. There's also a stairwell that connects to other floors. For security reasons, the doors to the stairs are never locked, officially to allow staff easy access in emergencies. But unofficially, it's because no matter how many times they lock them, they would somehow open on their own. During night shifts, the hospital gets eerily quiet. Most of the administrative offices are empty, and the lights in the hallways are dimmed. It's routine for me to check on the patients, make sure the doors and windows are secure, and then spend most of my shift reviewing files and catching up on paperwork. One night, after finishing my rounds, I was sitting in the nurse's room, flipping through a new patient's file. My auxiliary nurse asked if she could rest for a while, so she laid down on the couch, facing the wall. Everything seemed normal until I started hearing footsteps in the corridor. At first, I ignored them, assuming it was just a patient who couldn't sleep. But as the steps continued, up and down the hallway, stopping near the door before turning back, I decided to check the security cameras. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but I could still hear the footsteps. I stood up, planning to investigate, when one of the patients, room 7, started calling out frantically. I peeked out of the nurse's room. No one in the corridor. The footsteps had stopped. I rushed to his room. The patient was curled up against the headboard, his eyes wide with fear. He kept shouting about a man in a top hat sitting in the chair by his bed, telling me to make him leave. I glanced at the chair. It was empty. When a patient is in distress, sometimes the best approach is to play along with their delusions. So I turned toward the chair and firmly told the invisible visitor that visiting hours were over, and he needed to leave. The patient instantly calmed down and thanked me, lying back down. I went back to the nurse's room, feeling uneasy. When I checked the cameras again, my heart nearly stopped. Right in the middle of the hallway, in front of room 7, was a dark shadow. It was tall, standing motionless. I hesitated before stepping out to check with my own eyes. The hallway was empty, but when I looked back at the screen, the shadow was still there. Then, suddenly, it moved. It turned toward me, and for the first time, I saw its eyes, dark red, glowing faintly. It let out an awful screech and rushed straight into the patient's room, slamming the door shut behind it. My auxiliary nurse woke up at the noise, startled, asking me what had happened. I was too shaken to explain everything, but I grabbed her and dragged her with me to room 7. The air was ice cold. The room's air conditioning was set to a normal temperature, but the second we stepped in, it felt like we had walked into a freezer. My breath turned visible in the air. My hands were shaking as I reached for the light switch. There, standing by the patient's bed, was the shadow. It had the shape of a man, tall and broad, with that same eerie top hat. I whispered to my auxiliary nurse, asking if she saw it, but she looked at me confused. She couldn't see anything. The shadow turned toward me again. This time it didn't rush. It just faded. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. As soon as it disappeared, the air in the room warmed up again. The patient was still asleep, breathing normally. We left the room, and I sat back at my desk, staring at the cameras for the rest of the night, unable to relax. The next day, when I did my morning rounds, I found the patient in room 7 had passed away. That was the first time I saw the man in the top hat, but it wouldn't be the last. It keeps happening. Every time I see him, it's always the same. He appears at the foot of a patient's bed, and within 2 days, they're gone. I don't know if he's causing their deaths or simply marking them, but I know what I see is real. Other nurses don't believe me, but they admit that strange things happen in this hospital. Unexplainable cold spots, whispers in empty rooms, objects moving on their own. If you're a nurse, or if you know someone who works in a place like this, ask them. See if they've experienced something similar. Maybe we're not alone in this. Maybe others have seen him too. And if you ever find yourself in a hospital room, awake in the middle of the night, and you notice a shadow standing at the foot of your bed, don't look at it too long. It might be looking back.